Hello and welcome to another episode of KARE 11 on the Record. I'm political reporter Danny Spiewak. This final week of the 2026 legislative session at the Minnesota State Capitol has been fast-paced and at times tense, including a sit-in by House Democrats trying to force a vote on a bill that includes gun restrictions and an assault weapons ban. One of the chief authors on that bill is Representative Emma Greenman, a DFL member who represents the area of Minneapolis that includes Annunciation Church. We talked to her about her role in the gun debate, as well as her service on the House Fraud Committee. She's a minority member of that GOP-led House committee. Well, Representative, thank you for joining us here at the Capitol. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for being here at our beautiful people's house.
That's right. Yeah. You have been a Democrat on the Republican-led Fraud Committee in the House for the last 2 years. As that committee has wrapped up its work, how would you characterize what the last 2 years have looked like on that committee?
I think it was a real missed opportunity to do the nonpartisan policy work that Minnesotans are asking us to do. Anytime someone rips off the government, rips off the people who need our services the most, it is not just wrong, but it is something we need to take action on. And what we saw with this Fraud Prevention and Government Oversight Committee, it was a lot of politics and not any policy. There was lots of good policy happening in other places under the dome, but that committee felt like it was meant for campaigns, not for actually doing the work that the people sent here to do.
Chair Robbins, of course, has defended her work. They did bring in a lot of commissioners. There was a lot of discussion of important fraud issues. Do you believe there was any value in the people that were brought in to testify over the last 2 years?
I will say I learned a lot. Some of it was from the reporting that you all and others have done. Much of it was from presentations that we heard the second or third time after another committee had already heard them. I heard the OLA, I think it was the third or fourth time I heard the OLA's Feed Our Future report. And so certainly that information that was brought into that committee is important, but the committee itself wasn't adding any value. And the real missed opportunity was what we could have been doing, which is we could have been taking all that information that the OLA had done, that we have heard in news reports that other committees were hearing, and actually talked about how do we get to the root of the problem, as opposed to just admiring the problem and using it to go after the political opposition of the GOP majority.
The GOP majority has issued its majority report now. While there were many recommendations, there were also some parts that said that they believed that the Democrats had created a culture of fraud. Do you believe your party has a responsibility on the issue of fraud, given that it happened under the governor's watch?
I think everybody in public office has a responsibility to ensure that services are provided to people who need them and that we are good stewards of taxpayer dollars. I think that means in Medicaid, that means if we're looking at misclassification fraud, and that also means all the other ways and conversations about the way people are ripping off government that we didn't have in that hearing because it wasn't a target. It didn't create a good soundbite for Walz or Attorney General Ellison or Ilhan Omar. What I believe is that we all have a responsibility to do the nonpartisan policy work that gets to the root of the vulnerabilities, why systems and structures were vulnerable to fraud, and then stop it. And that's the work that has been happening in other committees, but did not happen in that committee.
In the other committees, the bills that have moved, and some of them going to the governor's desk, like the Inspector General bill and others, Medicaid Fraud Control Unit is moving forward. Have you been pleased with the bipartisan progress on some of those bills this session?
Yes, and actually going back to, and this is why I don't think it's a fair characterization, the way that Robbins was characterizing it, going back to 2023, this work of the legislature, in that case it was a trifecta. In the last 2 years, it's been in this tie. In both cases, there's been intense and very good work that's looking at why have our systems been vulnerable and how do we stop fraudsters from taking advantage of that. And that work continues. The work we've done in the last 2 years, again, I think, and there were people on that committee who did work in other spaces, including me, but it wasn't as part of that committee hearing. And the problem with that is that we had a real opportunity to do something more than just look at the siloed places this is happening, but look across government and say, how do we protect Minnesotans? How do we protect the people who rely on services? And how do we protect taxpayers from these fraudsters who are ripping off our government? How do we look at that business model of fraud? And we just the GOP, their agenda, which presented this both very one-sided but also just not super productive campaign bait, campaign ad bait, did not use our time wisely and did not allow us to do the work that I think was happening in other committees.
Looking at another big issue this session, of course, gun violence prevention. The Senate passed the package, but in the House it hasn't come up for a vote. Have you been surprised that it hasn't reached the floor from the Speaker?
So I represent the district where Annunciation, the tragedy happened, and I have been working closely with students and families. And I know actually, it's not just me and Senator Mohammed, it is folks across the legislature who have been hearing the demands, the real pleas from families, from kids, from the 70% of Minnesotans who want us to take action on gun violence, want us to ban these weapons of war. And I don't know how anybody in my body or theirs could look these families in the eye and not actually respond. And that's what we're seeing happen in the Minnesota House. We are seeing the Republicans, and particularly Speaker Demuth, not even just tell them no. She is literally blocking the bill and hiding it from them. So yes, I am not just surprised, I am really disappointed. That's not leadership. That is both cowardly, and it is not listening to the 70% of Minnesotans who are asking us to take action to protect kids and communities from the #1 killer of children, which is guns.
Do you believe if the Senate package got to the House floor, there would be at least a couple of Republicans that might consider supporting it?
I can't. I am not the best person to tell you what is going on with Republicans right now. What I do know is that in lots of their districts, and particularly some of the more competitive districts, I know, because I hear from them too, that their constituents, their communities, their voters are reaching out and saying, you now have a comprehensive package. You have something that focuses on intervention, prevention, and harm reduction. You can do something about the guns hand in hand with doing something about mental health and about threat reporting. You can do all of that, and you have the bill in front of you that's been negotiated and has lots of changes to reflect a pretty diverse set of people, of stakeholders, and of communities. And to ignore and block that is, again, it is not just disappointing, it is real dereliction of leadership.
Given the fact that it occurred in your district, it's obviously very personal for you. I know talking to some of the Republicans like Floor Leader Niska, he's talked about how tragic the event was and how upsetting it was for him, but that he just doesn't see the assault-style weapon ban as being the correct option. What do you make of the argument from Republicans that they just don't believe it's effective and constitutional?
So neither of those are true if we look at facts. And what I know that these families and decades of families who've been impacted by this, right? Annunciation and our community is just the most recent community that has joined this terrible club of folks who have been impacted by gun violence. We have evidence and data. The Violence Prevention Project has said you need a multi-layer approach and you have to do something about the guns. The Second Amendment, we keep hearing that, but there are 12 other states that have assault weapons bans, and all of those have been upheld by appellate courts. So there really isn't anything other than a refusal to engage. And the thing I will say, and the thing that is very hard, is, and it's hard for me to hear because I feel the pressure and the pleas just as much as they should, right? This is not Emma Greenman, this is my first bill that I have carried on guns. And the reason I am doing it is because the demands that I'm getting from those families, but also from kids across the state, from families across the state, is do something about these weapons that were made for war. And that's what we're gonna do because we're listening to people, we're listening to communities who are saying, choose us, not these guns. Like the NRA and the gun lobby, they are making it very hard for the politics of some of these Republicans, but it's not our job to come in here and represent the gun lobby or the NRA, it's our job to represent our constituents, and they have spoken very clearly on this.
Welcome back. Representative Emma Greenman has also been at the forefront of activity in the legislature around artificial intelligence, as well as prediction markets, which have exploded in recent years, not only in Minnesota, but across the country. We continue our conversation with her now. Looking at another topic that actually has gotten bipartisan support to move forward, prediction market regulations and a ban. Tell us about that. How did you get involved in looking at regulations around that?
So we have seen an explosion of gambling just in the last set of months, I mean less than a year, of these very shadowy, shady prediction markets. And what they are is they allow you to bet on literally anything, death and war and people's misfortunes, the weather. And what we are seeing and the real impact we're seeing on people and communities is we're seeing it lead to an explosion of gambling, particularly focusing on 18 to 21-year-olds, which is having a real public health impact. I got involved because what I started to see was the billions of dollars that are being poured in to pushing these markets. I saw the grift and the conflict of interest and fraud that's happening with Don Jr. joining the board of both Polymarket and Kelshi and then changing all the rules. We in Minnesota have, since we were a territory, regulated gambling for the benefit of the public and to protect public health. And now in the last year, because of a set of very conflicted and corrupt relationships, suddenly we're seeing this explosion. Minnesota's going to have to intervene, and that's what we are doing here, to protect people and our kids and protect the lawful gambling that has been carefully negotiated and balanced throughout the history of the state.
I'll leave you just on this last question. Reflecting on the last 2 years, you've been in tied house, unprecedented in recent memory at least. How would you say things went? I know the session obviously isn't quite over yet, but how would you characterize just what the last 2 years were like for you in the tied house?
Well, this was a year, I think the last 2 years have been unprecedented in so many ways. I mean, I was elected in 2020, so every year is an unprecedented year. I feel like I'm just looking for a precedented one. But, we started watching what happened and what the Republican majority did, which is run over the rules and conduct what was essentially a nonviolent coup. And then last year, we lost Melissa Hortman to gun violence from Mark and Melissa. And then Annunciation happened. So I think the question for me for the last 2 years is how have we been responding to the needs of the people outside of these halls, whether it's on gun violence, whether it's on protecting our most vulnerable folks, whether it's on making sure that government is not a mark for fraud. And I think that what has been really hard and frustrating is when some of my colleagues don't want to do that work with us. Some of my colleagues would rather make clips or do videos or frankly just not engage, sort of like we talked about with the Prevention Committee. But what I know is that the reason I'm here and the reason that I know many of my caucus are here is to respond to those needs and respond to things when we see prediction markets hurting kids. We're going to get involved and we're going to do something about it. And so I am looking forward to having that conversation with folks in our community when we are back this summer and really talking about what their needs are and the work we have to do moving forward.
Okay. Representative Greenman, we really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Welcome back. The final days of any legislative session at the state capitol are always marked by intense negotiations between legislative leaders and the governor. Nobody knows that better than former GOP House Speaker Kurt Daudt, who was the speaker from 2012 to 2018. We talked with him earlier this week about his thoughts on the end of this session, as well as how he would be handling the Democratic sit-in in the House. Joining me now is former Minnesota House Speaker Kurt Daudt. Kurt, thanks for taking some time on KARE 11 on the Record. We appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me on.
So I guess the first thing I want to ask you is when you get to the final days of the session, do you get nostalgic or miss serving in the legislature at this time of year, or are you like, I'm good not being there right now?
I tell you what, that's a mixed bag. There are things I definitely miss. I miss the people. And the one thing that I liked the most about being in the legislature was the negotiating and the kind of deal making at the end of session. So this is about the only time I miss being in the legislature, but they've got a lot of demands pulling on them from every direction, and of course they have to land the plane safely. And right now, with divided government in the House, a tied House, and a one-vote Democrat majority in the Senate, it's certainly challenging, and you have to work with both sides. So they'll have to figure out how to land that plane safely here in the next 72 hours.
You obviously have a lot of experience with working in divided government and having to negotiate across the aisle, across chamber. Just take our viewers inside those negotiations. What does that look like when you're trying to broker deals with the governor and other legislative leaders on key issues?
Well, there's a different dynamic based on what year it is too. So this is not a budget year, which I think takes a little bit of the weight off. In a budget year, you're funding, which was last year, you're funding state government for a 2-year period, and if you don't fund state government before the July 1st, things shut down. In the second year, it's almost more demanding on the legislative leaders because not only you don't have the budget that you have to accomplish, but you also don't have the leverage of the budget. So when you have to accomplish something, it kind of helps you get stuff done. This year, there's not a lot that really has to happen, and if they don't do things, government's not going to shut down. So obviously, there's a long list of wants and needs on both sides, but ultimately, they're going to have to negotiate to figure out what can I give you to get what I want, and they'll have to find the right balance. And typically, to give you an idea of what happens kind of behind closed doors, those meetings usually start a few weeks out, and the legislature very often includes the governor because the governor has to sign the bills. But in the past, sometimes the legislature has just made the deal on their own and sent the bills to the governor and hoped that he signed them, which is exerting a little more power, I think, and a little more of the legislature's prerogative. Letting the governor kind of be at the table and have a three-way negotiations that has been the practice in recent years. But the folks will sit down and basically kind of go through what their priorities are, and they'll have to do some horse trading to get what they want, and you have to give a little, and that's the part that can be the toughest in those negotiations.
At the end of the session here, we've seen a sit-in from Democratic members in the House over the gun restrictions that they want to see come to the floor. You went through something similar in 2018. If you were Speaker Dameth right now, how would you be handling the situation?
I think it's interesting. I think the Democrats are actually doing a good job of messaging here. This is an issue that's obviously important to them and important to their constituents. I think there's an opportunity for Republicans to kind of go back to the process and say, well, this bill hasn't made it through committee yet in the House. We don't just take up a bill that comes from the Senate and vote on it. And the public doesn't always understand that process. But I would also say there hasn't been a single Republican vote for this bill in any committee in either chamber. And I would kind of push back on the Democrats and say, if this issue is that important to you, we're in divided government right now. You should sit down. And so let's actually sit down and talk about what we can do. Let's not play politics with an issue that's so important and something that doesn't have a single Republican vote when you need Republican votes. What it tells me that the Democrats are doing basically is using this more for politics than they are to actually get the bill passed. I think there is probably a path to get something done, but this is what the Democrats want. This is their kind of highest wish list. And they're pushing it through and putting pressure on the Republicans. I don't think they're going to be successful. And unfortunately, that tells me that it's probably more about politics. And in an election year, that's the sort of thing that can kind of steer the car off the road into the ditch. So we'll see how it proceeds. But that's the advice that I would give.
The Democrats often cite public polling around the issue of assault-style weapons, and they believe that the public opinion is in their favor, and they believe this is going to be a winning issue for them in the election. Do you see vulnerabilities for Republicans, especially in kind of more moderate purple districts, that this could be an issue that could lead them to lose the election?
I think there can be in the kind of suburban metro districts, certainly. I think it's an issue that the Democrats know that they're somewhat misrepresenting. This is, if this bill passes, it is unconstitutional. It will get challenged as it has in other states, and it will be overturned. So I think the Republicans' position is a little more realist, and the Democrats' position is, we want to make a statement because we believe it's the right thing to do. And I don't know that either one of those is wrong, but ultimately, if they want to make progress on this issue, they're going to have to work together, and that hasn't happened yet at the Capitol.
When you've been looking at other issues that have passed, have you been surprised that even in the narrowly divided legislature, when you're looking at one vote in the Senate, tie in the House, that they've gotten stuff done around fraud, the Inspector General? Have you been pleasantly surprised by that?
I have been. I think some of the things that I've seen probably aren't things I would have done, or I would have negotiated them differently. But I think they are working together and they are getting some things accomplished. I think the Office of Inspector General is something that will likely be helpful on fraud. I actually think the time to tackle the fraud issue was last year during the budget year, because I think that what they did last year, rather than tackle the fraud by kind of not appropriating money, or when they were appropriating money to these programs, they should have put restrictions in that language to say that if you don't meet these requirements of oversight, then this money cannot be appropriated, something to that effect. That's with the actual appropriation of the dollars that went into these programs is when you have the teeth to put language in to actually make a difference. And right now they have just struggled to get any language into statute to kind of put oversight in. They were able to get the Office of Inspector General through, but that's kind of an after the fact thing. It's not really what protections have we put in place before the money goes out the door. So I think they probably fell short on putting protections into statute last year, but the Office of Inspector General should be a positive move. And I think that shows that they have accomplished some good things. I think the fact that they're going to do a bonding bill and some tax relief means that they are working together and they're going to get some stuff done. I will say, with the messaging that's coming off the House floor and some of the video that I saw yesterday, it does seem like things are devolving and becoming more polarized. Much as we feel politically in society right now, it's kind of being amplified by our representatives in the legislature. So I worry that things could still kind of melt down before we get to the end, and that fragile agreement that they have on the issues that they've talked about might ultimately fall apart if this sort of animosity towards each other continues over the next 24 or 36 hours.
Okay, that's former Minnesota House Speaker Kurt Daudt. Kurt, thanks for your time.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for joining us on KARE 11 on the Record. Find us every Sunday morning at 6:30 a.m. and streaming on KARE 11 Plus.